So, ladies and gentlemen, I understood the meaning of this panel to be something like, what has Shakespeare got to do with crises, in particular with current crises? When I was thinking about this topic, or thinking about what I could do for a topic, what rose before my mind's eye was this particular picture, an image of a young woman with reddish curls, dressed in a white farthingale, who enthusiastically welcomed us, the audience, to the show she was going to produce, a one-woman show called Lady M. And this happened in The Hague sometime last year. This woman, the actress, introduced herself as the original of the gentlewoman to Lady Macbeth, who makes a very brief appearance only in Shakespeare's play, together with the doctor, to discuss and witness the lady's illness, her sleepwalking and her obsessive hand-washing, out damn spot, that stuff, you know. And she then goes on, this gentlewoman, she goes on to tell her side of the story, which, so she claims, would have merited far more than a brief appearance as a bit part, that's the word she herself uses, in a single scene of the play written by Shakespeare. Her story, as she sees it, is that of a rise in fortunes from a humble scullery maid who has to put out the dustbin to Lady Macbeth's lady-in-waiting. When she's still a scullery maid, she hero worships her mistress, her lord, and particularly the king. And she takes great pride in making up his bed as meticulously as possible when he comes to visit. But then her great chance in life arises, when inadvertently she witnesses the murder of Duncan. Lady Macbeth is aware of her having seen this, and she bribes her, the scullery maid, by offering her a promotion to her lady-in-waiting. And then, over her simple white garment, the former scullery maid now wears a rich red bodice as a token of her social rise, but also of her sharing the guilt of the Macbeths. And like her betters, she pays for her rise by not being able to sleep anymore. And again, like her betters, she's caught up in the maelstrom of events that follow, which all narrates and mimes in a lively manner. The collapse of Macbeth's kingdom causes friction between herself and her mistress, and she blames Lady Macbeth for bringing about this state of affairs, to which Lady Macbeth replies, "You only live by the grace of me," and threatens her with a knife. This is the moment the gentlewoman grabs to change history, she claims, for she grabs the knife itself and kills Lady Macbeth. And so she tells the audience as an almost final word, "Will you please remember that I committed her suicide?" The general idea behind this play, Lady M, may seem very familiar. Rewriting Shakespeare's tragedies from the perspective of a minor character, particularly one of a lower class, has been with us at least since Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, and it's recently also been expanded to other authors such as Jane Austen, whose Pride and Prejudice has been totally turned upside down by being viewed from the perspective of the servants in Joe Baker's novel Longbourn. Yet there also seemed to be a further dimension to this particular play, Lady M. Whereas the focus on the bystanders of a Shakespeare play or an Austen novel usually serves to show that these people also matter and deserve to be taken seriously, the scullery maid is in fact filled with rancor. She herself demands to be taken seriously by her mistress, most of all by Shakespeare. The direct reason for her murdering Lady Macbeth is that the latter complains about her own suffering and her guilt. So the gentlewoman's response is, Well, what a coincidence. The reason I cannot sleep anymore, my lady, is because your conscience is so heavily laden. As for Shakespeare, she protests that he has relegated her to a single scene, has given her even less coverage than the drunken porter, and most of all, has obscured her historical significance by merely stating that Lady M, as 'tis thought by self and violent hands, took off her life. As if I never happened, the gentlewoman adds. Not interesting enough to be blamed for this, Shakespeare must have thought. And she then ends the play by a loud exclamation, which I did not put on a PowerPoint slide, "Fuck Shakespeare." Feeling neglected, undervalued, this former member of the repressed underclass, once she comes into a little significance, now turns into a complete monster, who will assert her importance, if necessary even by priding herself on having committed a murder. The revenge of the repressed, you might say. And as such, this play seemed to me to be a response also to one of the major causes of the current crisis in Europe, the rise of populism, regarded as the rise of simple people who perhaps have a legitimate grievance against those that exploited them, yet react by extreme measures. And Shakespeare, therefore, is the vehicle for a rumination on this phenomenon. The fact that Lady M originally dates from 2006, though it has been revised since, does not, I think, invalidate that reading. And here I must go into a little bit of Dutch recent history, but you'll see it's also relevant, I think, to other nations. Okay? So as far as the Netherlands are concerned, the first phase of the populist revolution came to a head with a steady rise. Oops, I'm sorry, I seem to be one behind. It came to a head with a steady rise in the election polls of a maverick politician called Pim Fortuyn, followed by his assassination in 2002. And then the next phase of the populist revolution was inaugurated in 2004 when Geert Wilders trod in the footsteps of Fortuyn with his extreme right Freedom Party, so-called Freedom Party. Both of these politicians relied on their appeal to large groups of voters who felt left out of the economic boom of the preceding years and who felt threatened by immigration and globalization, which also came to be associated increasingly with the concept of Europe. And in their frustration and rancor, they turned to extremist politicians who promised redress, even if the measures they promised looked rather unworkable. And of course, the recent election victory of Donald Trump, helped by those whom Hillary Clinton had rather ungenerously called those deplorables, is another instance of this same kind of impulse. So the main issue for us, however, is whether we could say that it is really Shakespeare that has put this political development on the agenda. Is this an instance of facing the crisis with the help of Shakespeare's play? Or is it just an appropriation of Shakespeare for ends of which he himself was blissfully unaware? And one might argue that the latter must simply be the case. After all, the gentlewoman's rancor expresses itself also in a rejection of Shakespeare, as she ended her play saying, "Fuck Shakespeare," for having neglected her role in history. And indeed, we have to agree that this is so. Shakespeare may here and there in his tragedies and histories have some sympathy for the plight of commoners, but he clearly concentrates on the suffering of princes and noblemen. He's not really interested in ordinary people, not that much. Apart from that, of course, this play is totally new and is not really Shakespeare's work at all, you might say. However, as for the latter point, you might also object that this sort of appropriation also happens in productions that are clearly based on Shakespeare's own text, such as, another example, yes, we have it here, a staging in 2014 of Julius Caesar by het Zuidelijk Toneel. And that production clearly framed the Roman tragedy about the rise and assassination of a populist leader as an analogue to the rise and death of Pim Fortuyn. For instance, through the choice of a bald-headed actor for Caesar. You can see him in the back here. This is the spirit of Caesar appearing to Brutus, and he physically resembles Pim Fortuyn. I'm sure that's not a coincidence. Yep. So this too was an appropriation of Shakespeare, but using his own text throughout. So the difference, one might argue, is one of degree. I think there is a further point to be made about Lady Macbeth. And that is that, as far as it seems to deviate from Shakespeare's original, the one-woman play also follows his lead in a number of essentials. You might say it translates the story of Macbeth to a lower social class, a class that modern audience perhaps can relate to more easily. The character of the gentlewoman may be an addition to the play, but her development from a modest, long-suffering drudge into an upwardly mobile, yet vengeful and violent person is somewhat similar to Macbeth's own development. Originally he is content to do Duncan's dirty work, and he is then praised by everybody for his nobility and his valour. But once he's defeated the enemies of the realm, he is offered a reward for his efforts. He will take the place of the Thane of Cawdor, one of the traitors he's defeated. But this promotion does not really satisfy him. Instead, it only whets his ambition for more. As some critic, and I'm afraid his name has escaped me, has argued, Macbeth may even have some legitimate reason to expect that he might be offered more. The succession to the throne, that is to say. For it remains unclear in the play whether Scotland is an elective monarchy, which elects its kings, or whether it's a hereditary monarchy, where the son of the king succeeds him. In other words, when Duncan names Malcolm as his successor, Macbeth may have had a legitimate reason to feel aggrieved. Nevertheless, he obtains his wish by a bloody and far from honourable deed, murdering Duncan. And had he not done that, he would not have ended up as Shakespeare's hero to begin with. So, if we summarise... I should have had one more. Yeah, there it is. If we summarise the play like this, we can see that there are actually parallels between Shakespeare's hero and the gentlewoman. Both are originally modest people, hard-working servants. Both are promoted, but this only whets their appetite for more. And both react violently when frustrated. Because of this crime, both become the protagonists of a play. So in this view, the main difference between them is class. The gentlewoman's career is a demotic version of Macbeth's aristocratic rebellion. And this is also underlined when the scullery maid describes how she is doing all sorts of dirty work in the beginning of her career. She has to collect the eggs in the chicken coop, put out the dirty and heavy dustbin while a rat runs down her back, while at the same time Macbeth and Banquo are carving up the enemies on the battlefield. So clearly the scullery maid's work is a mock-heroic version of what Macbeth does. Yet it also calls our attention to the underlying similarities, quite apart from the class difference. Now, quite obviously, though, this analysis also leaves aspects of Shakespeare's play out of account. For instance, the metaphysical prompting of the witches. Lady Macbeth's appeal to her husband's manhood, for which there are no equivalents in the story of the scullery maid. And the fact that Macbeth kills his victim Duncan for the sake of calculated ambition rather than out of spontaneous rancour, as seems to be the case with a scullery maid turned gentlewoman. In other words, Lady M's Macbeth is just one Macbeth, one possible Macbeth, out of a large range of possibilities. Just like the Julius Caesar resembling Pim Fortuyn, the murdered Dutch extremist or a populist politician, was just one possible Julius Caesar. Such adaptations and appropriations flatten the original, make a choice out of several possible readings to make their Shakespeare speak to issues alive in the present. We mean by Shakespeare, as Terence Hawkes would have it. Yet we can do so only because Shakespeare lends himself to so many different readings, because his text is so incredibly rich. So what does this mean for our question? Does Shakespeare help us face the current crisis in Europe? I think the answer to that must be not automatically, not in himself, but he can be used to shed light on such issues because of the great variety of human motivation that is present in his work. The root of populism can be extracted from his plays if we look for them diligently enough. It must be a process of cooperation in which we bring our questions, perhaps even our own embryonic answers to his texts, and which he then can often yield the raw material on the basis of which we can formulate and shape our answers more precisely. It should go on. Yeah. In the foreword to their published text of Lady M and other monologues not by Shakespeare, so it's a whole book of similar kinds of one-woman, one-man plays, the authors themselves are unsure to what extent they are using Shakespeare's material and to what extent they are reading their own concerns into his work. In one passage they say, "The continued dreaming and thinking about the characters created by Shakespeare, however small, repeatedly offers a new view of the as yet untold world that he managed to hint at with the smallest turn of phrase." But in another passage they say, "We proudly present to you the results of our research into what can be read between the lines or into what Shakespeare, possibly out of foolhardiness, never wished to reveal." So is it discovering what Shakespeare had to say about issues like populism, even in the smallest hint? Or is it reading such modern issues into his works? As I've suggested, it's a little bit of both. Shakespeare is a point of reference for us to start discussing European crises, yet we also need to read into his lines or investigate how others, such as theatre makers, have done so for us. Thank you.